Hey, welcome to the Hot Dish, comfort food for Middle America. I'm Heidi Heitkamp.
And I'm Joel Heitkamp. We're going to get educated today, right, Heidi?
Well, who knows? I mean, you went to grade school in Manador where, 2 classes, or did you have 3 classes in every grade?
Well, if you count kindergarten, the first one was 3 classes. But after that, it was 3 all the way through.
Well, think about this, Joel. The subject that we're going to be talking about today is about rural education and this privatization of public education. Do you remember that private school that was down the street from Manador Grade School?
Yeah,
Neither do
no,
I.
no. We didn't quite have that same opportunity, did we?
This is the point. When we're looking at privatization of education, which is what I call, basically giving private schools public money, guess what? Rural gets left behind because we don't have private education in rural America.
Well, North Dakota always did a pretty good job, I felt, from both sides of the aisle of not funding private education through public dollars. But the governor actually said he would sign it. In fact, he ran on it. He said, if this happens, I'm going to do it. I think that private education should get the funding because they have kids too. So I'm making the argument if you're an elderly person and you don't have kids, you shouldn't have to pay taxes in.
Well, I think, Joel, that I would be okay with this if they had to enroll everybody who applied within their service area.
Well,
Yeah.
they don't.
I know.
Yep.
That's the point. The point is that they're cherry picking. Anyway, we're talking about school vouchers, as you can see, and other challenges to education, particularly education in rural America.
That's right. Heidi is going to talk to J.C. Bowman, a teacher and education policymaker from Tennessee, then One Country Project board member and Iowa state representative. And I might add, great pitcher. Representative J.D. Scholten is going to speak with Julie Van Haefen, a North Carolina state representative and school teacher. Before we get into it, we know what many of you are asking. What can I do? How can I help stop Social Security from getting cut? Stop the USDA from being gutted? Stop the destruction of the Department of Education? Well, we hear you. And we're going to tell you we're working on a hot dish episode dedicated solely to this topic. We want to offer you, our listeners, a guide on how we can all fight back and do what we can now. So stay tuned. In the meantime, check out One Country Project on Substack to hear from rural leaders about what you can do, and keep listening to the Hot Dish podcast.
I hope that all of you who care about rural America, care about kids, and I know that's our listener base, are paying attention to this education fight, because it's not just North Dakota. Last time, the governor vetoed a privatization bill, and that's what we should be calling it, not a school voucher, but a privatization bill. And that's not going to happen this time. And all across the country, and this is a tribute to the other side that has absolutely plays the long game. They don't take a loss in one legislative session, then not come back in the next one. Right, Joel?
Well, and in North Dakota here right now, President Trump is actually running commercials to privatize education.
Really?
Yeah, he and Governor Armstrong are running commercials to make sure those public dollars go into private education, and they have flooded the TV airways with it, Heidi.
Well, what's the pitch, Joel?
Well, the pitch is all about school choice. You know, how school choice is going to do nothing but help students. The counter arguments are never obviously mentioned, so that they can make a case against the easy arguments to point out, which you have just now, which is public school takes any student that comes their way. Private education doesn't have to do that. When it comes to curriculum, public school offers it. Private school does what they say they want to do. I'm going to add one more thing. The new school in Fargo actually has a requirement. This is a religious school in South Fargo. They have a requirement that all female teachers sign a pledge for abstinence, that they will not have sex if they're not married. I'm not kidding about this.
Yeah.
And we're going to use public dollars to fund that, you know?
Oh, no. I mean, but this is a bigger issue across the country. It's not just happening in North Dakota. And the other thing people need to understand about these organizations that are offering private education, they don't have any accountability. So how are you going to know whether you're getting any kind of effective bang for your buck? And in places where they've done this, Joel, they haven't expanded enrollment. They simply have paid for the kids who are already there. The kids whose parents live in, the wealthier part of town, who go to those schools get subsidized, but functionally it hasn't expanded choice. What it's done is basically pay for the choice people have already made.
Well, if you look at the private schools facilities, which show they're not broke one bit, I would have liked to have played on those fields with artificial turf, with lights that lit up the way they did, and with the brand new grandstands and concession stands. These guys have money. I mean, they do. They have money.
And the one thing, when you go back and kind of look at this movement, people don't pay attention until something gets taken away, right? So it's like, oh, well, that's just in the background. Now all of a sudden, if the education dollars for public education diminish and your kid is a kid who's still in public education, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get hurt with the deviation of those dollars to a school that doesn't have accountability standards, right? There isn't any kind of measurement that they have to abide by. They don't have to take every student who applies.
Oh,
Donald Trump, he says the education should be a state-based issue. Why are you running ads in states like North Dakota?
well, but one of the things that goes along with that is that Republican legislators have had such a major foothold, a majority, that the people that would normally take these people on in the halls of the Capitol are afraid of them.
Yeah.
And because they're afraid of them, they don't lobby against it the same way they would. They don't push measures because they're fearful of what's going to happen to them. Very similar to what's happening on a national scale. And so governing through fear is what's happening here. And the private boys need to get a punch in the nose. And on News and Views, we do it every day.
Well, we'll see how this plays out, and we will continue to talk about education because I think for a lot of people, it's a sleeper issue kind of moving forward. I am here with J.C. Bowman. He is the executive director and CEO of Professional Educators of Tennessee. He has over a decade of experience as a teacher and over 2 decades of education policy experience working to better public school policies in Tennessee, Florida, and actually nationwide. Thanks so much for joining us, JC, and welcome to the Hot Dish.
Thank you for having me, Senator.
Well, this is a big topic all across state legislatures. I think what's so interesting is, they're talking about eliminating the Department of Education as a cabinet level position in Washington, and that's sucked a lot of energy in the policy space out of the room. But and I know all across the country, there is this movement to basically privatize public education being kind of the bedrock, in my opinion, of our democracy and the ability to grow great citizens. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about, from your experience, what are you seeing kind of nationwide in this movement?
Well, I think we've got both an urban and a rural divide in education. I think we've seen an opportunity to measure schools and measure education. We all think if we're going to fund something, you measure it to see whether it's successful or not. So the testing industry developed alongside of all of this. And what ended up happening was that we started testing our schools, and I think get tied into the privatization piece of this. And all of a sudden, our public schools were failures in order to privatize. There's nothing public schools can do to get out of that mode of failures. And what's happening in the privatization side of this is there's little to no accountability. Public schools have expanded choice, whether it's open enrollment, you can take your child to another school, magnet schools, career academies within public schools. All of these are things, and public schools have expanded out in there. But what has happened is that the whole mission for education reform. I did an article a few years ago called "Reform the Reformers."
Mm-hmm.
People that are further removed. Most of these people that are now driving the reform narrative have never spent any time in education, let alone public education.
Don't you think part of the problem is that for years, people who believe in public schools have resisted a narrative that we don't need to reform, we don't need to change. And that created a sense of resistance out there to progress. And so now they're kind of caught behind the screen, still not responding to what in fact are legitimate parent and consumer and government concerns about the quality of education in our country.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The initial reform movement led around one thing. How do we make public schools better? We bring charter schools in. And the goal with charter schools was to bring innovation in and implement within the public schools. And in fact, if the charter schools weren't working, you could close them. We've made it almost impossible now in Tennessee to close a failing charter school because it's making somebody money. Take a famous tennis star, Andre Agassi. He's made more money off funding buildings to open charter schools than he made in his tennis career. And,
Yeah.
that is a stunning statistic. And I think people looked at this and said, how can we make money and we want to get our hands into the public schools? And our public schools are essential for our communities, particularly in rural America. I mean, I go back to my hometown. I went to a football game, small high school, first time I'd gone to a high school football game in 20 years. And there had to have been 10,000, 15,000
Yeah.
city residents there on a Friday night. And that's where America is. And we forget that part.
Well, and what's interesting to me in a couple things, in almost all the bills that I've looked at, there is no level of accountability. By that, I mean, we can't survey what's going on. We won't look at test scores. We're just going to give you a bunch of money and you go ahead and do what you do. And there's no looking back. There's no accountability. And in places where they've done that in the privatization movement, they've discovered some real serious problems with the education quality in private schools. I want you to comment on that. But I also, what angers me probably more than anything in this movement is they aren't required to take everybody who applies.
No.
So a student that's struggling or a student that may have trouble, they don't want that student. They don't want a student with special needs. They don't want a student that has some additional learning disabilities. They just want to take the top students, maybe the top athlete, and put them in their private school and say, look, what a great job I'm doing, when they're basically cherry picking the best of the students.
Vulnerable students in our society are being discarded. And I'm a former special ed teacher, so I want to say that. And, students with disabilities are being moved to the side. We're seeing that when you talked about the federal government's role as it's being diminished. I fought for three things. I mean, I picked my battles. I can only pick one thing: Title I, free and reduced lunch.
Can you do this for me?
Yes, ma'am.
Because this Title I discussion is so important to the elimination of the Department of Education. A lot of Title I funding comes from the federal government. Just explain for our listeners, when we say Title I, what that means.
Well, those are the dollars that go to low income students. And so, the whole idea of this is that it takes more money. It's a proven fact. It takes more money to educate low income students because they're falling behind from the onset. But Title I targets these low income, and I'm adamant about that. And IDEA, which is special needs, special education. Those two areas are non-starter. And then you can't educate a child who is hungry. I'm sorry, you can't. I mean, that's just, and those are just basic building blocks.
Title I is actually going to HHS, according
Yes.
to the
Yeah.
president. So it's kind of this recognition, like, well, you deal with that because it's somehow a public health concern. So now you're putting public health people in charge and not educators, and that's a real problem.
I've not seen the transition plan.
And the other part is, to get good students into education, there's been loan forgiveness, but all of that's up in the air now too, under the student loan program. So all these people who said, look, I could go become an engineer, but I'm going to go be a math teacher because I care about education. And I'm going to get my education loan forgiven when I provide that service to, Tennessee or North Dakota. That's now all up in the air. And so there's just, I mean, there is this sense that somehow people who are not education professionals can so-called fix the education system. And it is I mean, when I had cancer, I didn't go see the dentist, right?
That's right. Yes,
I went
ma'am.
to an oncologist. So, how do educators, JC, like yourself, people who are concerned about the profession of education and teaching, how should they focus their energy right now?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. I tell people all the time, and this is my own personal philosophy: educate, then legislate. And part of
Hmm.
my education piece of this is I write a lot of editorials. I write a lot of information. I get a lot of stuff out there, and I'm trying to educate the public on issues that I feel like that they're not aware of to try to kind of balance it. And I think there's a disconnect between all sides. How do we meet in the middle? How can we at least reach a consensus? How can we go back and put value back into our public schools? What happened to the melting pot concept of bringing America together? We're getting tribalized further and further. And I think the privatization feeds right into that. Oh, you don't like having to go to school with someone of a different faith? Fine. We'll have a school for you. If you don't like doing this, we'll go have a school for you and we'll establish it. And we're going to pay the price for that as a society as it becomes more fragmented.
Yeah, I mean, I've always given the example of my father's generation. He was a World War II vet. He would never have known anyone from New York, but he went to the service. And his best friend was this man of Italian descent from New York. Did he have a different opinion about New Yorkers or about people who were Italian or just the people that he served with? Absolutely, had a way different opinion, having had that proximity and that experience. And we don't have anything that forces us to come together. Probably the closest example is, in fact, education. And now we're basically allowing education to be kind of self-selecting as well. Well, I'm only going to go to school with the Catholics. I'm only going to go to school with the Hindus. I mean, it's just not a formula for building a democracy in this country.
No, and I think we're going to be poor for it as a nation long term. And so, how do we get around that? I came from a different background, and I've always had different backgrounds from my family being different politically. It goes all the way back to the Civil War. I had both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, in my family tree, my dad was a diehard Democrat. My mom's a Republican, and look, it never impeded us at having dinner. So we
Yeah.
sat at the dinner table and had discussions, and we talked about issues, and it was great.
But the great experience that we had growing up, we knew that the public school was there and that people invested in higher education and that education was a way into the middle class. And that's one thing that the GI Bill taught us, which is when GIs came home and they were able to go to college or go back to school or get training, that built the entire economy of our country. And so our country is basically built on education. Our economy is built on education. Our way of life is built on education. But now we're dismantling those things that have shown such success in the past and in terms of building the exceptionalism that is America.
Oh, absolutely. I did the same thing your dad probably did. I couldn't have gone to college. I mean, I was that kid. I was in the middle. I was happy to graduate high school. I did I served in the Marine Corps. I'd like to tell you it's for noble reasons, but because I love my country and wanted to fight for it. No, I wasn't going to college and I certainly didn't want to go to work. So Marines look pretty good to me. I like the uniforms. And so we did the Marines, and then I got to go to college for the money. I had 3 years of funding. I went through college in 2.5 years because I had 3 years of funding.
Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
had 4 years, I'd
A-
probably done 3 years. But
Actually, my son-in-law did the exact same thing. Went and was able to get his CPA in 3 years. And so, we're all today in this spot where we're like looking at the news going, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's terrible. I mean, you're just everywhere you look, you feel like it's doom. But if you look beyond the day's news and you say, what are the real threats to America looking forward? This public school challenge to me is one of the most dastardly things that is happening on the horizon. And it didn't just come out of nowhere. This has been building for a long, long time. And it's now a continuation and it's been put on steroids with the elimination of the Department of Education and these state legislative efforts.
absolutely. And Senator, I tell you right now, our folks I mean, in Tennessee, if there were rural Republicans who voted against this bill,
Yep.
and some of them are paying a real heavy price because this was funded and by certain groups that are out there, 2 or 3 groups, Americans for Prosperity, AFC, the DeVos Group, and I mean these guys spent millions. We defeated them the first year, and the second year, this past year, where they passed the legislation, and the problem was there was nobody left to fight. A lot of people fell out of the fight. They didn't want to fight anymore, and they just doubled down and spent more. My guess, it cost them well over $100 million to pass this legislation in Tennessee.
When people say, well, but it's a political loser, you look to the north, you have a governor, Beshears, who literally ran on a pro public school education platform and was able to get elected as a Democrat in Kentucky.
Yes.
So the political support is there. But I want to dwell on the impacts to rural America and rural schools, because a lot of the Republican resistance is coming out of rural districts where people say, look, that may be good for you, but if I want to send my kid to a private school, I'm going to have to drive them 100 miles, round trip, or 200 miles round trip. So let's talk a little bit about why this is particularly bad for our rural schools.
Well, looking at it in Tennessee, 95 counties, and 50-something% of the counties didn't even have a private school. And then of that, most of them had between 2 and 5. The only place that it was feasible was in the urban areas. And we know 66%, and that's their number. I think it's higher. I think it's closer to 80% of the kids who will take advantage of a voucher in Tennessee are already students who are enrolled in private schools. And I do Chattanooga media a lot. I'm from Cleveland, down in that neck of the woods. And so when I do the Chattanooga media, I bring it up, 2 of the most exclusive private schools there. And I go, do you think if it's $59,000 a year to go to Baylor High School, that you want your taxpayer $7,000 to go to a school that's charging $59,000? And nobody wants that. I mean, they're
Right.
like, no, I don't want that. That's crazy. They don't need my money. They don't need my
And I think as this movement progresses, there is going to be 2 things that happen. There's going to be an analysis of who got those slots, because it wasn't the kid who had special needs. Trust me.
Right.
They don't want that kid. And it's going to be exactly what you say, which is all the money basically went to subsidize people who were already in private education.
And it absolutely does not benefit public schools. It doesn't make public schools 1 iota better.
But how do we build a better, more resilient coalition? Like you said, you beat it back once. I think that a number of states, it just doesn't go away because they've been in it for the long haul. They're well funded. And the pro public school, let's make our public schools better, those folks don't have the kind of resources to fight back on an equal footing.
Lay political labels aside. I have moved completely nonpartisan. I really don't care. I don't care about the labels anymore. I haven't in 15 years identified a party to anybody. I have a bill that's going to pass unanimously, probably. I better knock on wood because it hasn't passed yet. We have a bill that we worked out with behavior records transferring along with the academic records at the school. Passed the Senate in Tennessee 33-0. So it's already on its way to the House. It passed yesterday in committee 18-0. So we think it's going to go fast track and it'll easily pass. The bottom line is lay the political labels aside. Bring everybody to the table and have a discussion, and let's at least try to move together. We're never going to agree to everything, but what we will agree on is that public education is essential for our democracy. It's essential for our country. It's essential for the next generation. And if we don't pass this torch on, I fear for what that next generation is going to look like.
I hope that we have discussions going forward. I hope to stay on this issue. It's near and dear to my heart. I wouldn't be where I am without public education, without people investing money in schools and infrastructure. But I see that unraveling, and I see that as a loss of opportunity. But more importantly, on a macro sense, it's going to hurt the American economy and American, ability to be exceptional on the world stage. So, J.C., good luck.
Thank you.
Continue the fight. What is done can be undone. Let's just say that.
Thank you.
Hello, listeners. I'm J.D. Scholten, a One Country board member. Today, I'm speaking with North Carolina State Representative Julie von Haefen, who is also a longtime PTA leader and a substitute teacher. Welcome to the Hot Dish, Julie.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Yeah, so we get to talk about one of my favorite things, public education. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening in North Carolina and kind of what you've had and what you're up against right now?
Well, since the Republicans took over our North Carolina General Assembly back in 2011, I mean, we've seen just what I call death by a thousand cuts of our public education system in North Carolina. Over the years, they've just made many, many changes, to both teacher pay, to policies around public schools, really micromanaging our local school districts from the state level. And then, of course, the huge expansion of our private school voucher program, which of course started out as, quote unquote, a program for low income people to be able to send their kids to private school. But, that was just a wolf in sheep's clothing, that it was really just to privatize education in North Carolina. And unfortunately, they have almost achieved that goal by a really harmful bill that was passed last year, which basically lifted all of the income requirements for the private school voucher program. And now anybody in North Carolina can get a voucher, including millionaires who are already sending their kids to private school. And it also allowed people who were already sending their kids to private school to get that voucher. It used to be that you were, making the choice, as we hear, to send your kid and you needed help to do that. But now what's been happening since the expansion last year is that we just had a report actually this week about how now private schools are raising their tuitions all across North Carolina, because why wouldn't they now that they get free taxpayer money? So I think we're seeing the same game plan in many, many states, including your own, that where this is happening. And we're just another example of that.
Yeah, so my very first vote I voted against vouchers. And it's anticipated in year 4 to be 400% over budget. We don't have a cap. There's no auditing or reporting system. And just like what you mentioned, private schools are raising their tuitions. I think it's 75 or 80% of the students who use it were already in private schools. Like it's the same battles. So when did your voucher program get implemented initially or voted on?
Good question. I think it was back in the early, the 2013 timeframe. So
Oh, you guys
after.
were pretty early then.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it started slowly, right? And that's how
Yeah.
most things start, where they just kind of, hey, let's do a pilot program. And then, hey, let's expand it and let's, let more people in and those kind of things. So it was a slow roll up until last year. But then when they got the supermajority and we weren't able to stop it, that was when things really took off.
What was the impact on rural schools? Because that was a big thing we fought against in selling, like, school choice doesn't matter when you have to drive an hour to go to a private school.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can look at all the data that shows that most of the voucher recipients actually live in our more urban areas, including Raleigh and Charlotte and the Greensboro area. And many, many of our rural counties don't have even one private school. So that's what's so surprising about, how rural Republicans vote on vouchers, because most of the time it does not benefit their own constituents. They're actually benefiting me as a more urban legislator that lives in suburban Raleigh, where a lot of, people that live in this area, we have many, many private schools that receive vouchers. So, they're kind of voting against their own constituents' best interests. And, as we know, and as is happening in every state really across the country, our rural schools are suffering. Here in North Carolina, we've been putting more and more of the burden on funding our public schools, on our county commissions, on property taxes. And we know that the rural districts don't have the tax base to support our schools. And therefore, we're seeing more and more inequities, across our state. And this voucher program is just exacerbating that.
Now, are you seeing charter schools come in? We're starting to see that in Iowa here, where we really haven't had any charter schools, and now we're starting to see them trickle in out-of-state charter schools.
Well, unfortunately, that's another thing that's happened, since the Republicans took over our legislatures, that we used to have a cap on the number of charter schools in North Carolina at 100. They removed that cap several years ago. And so we had already had a major influx of for-profit national, corporations and coming in to operate charter schools all across our state. And so, yes, I mean, that's kind of already happened, where these charter schools are going in and kind of taking over some of these rural areas. So that was kind of the first wave, I think. And then the voucher and the expansion of private schools is now the second wave that's really hurt our public schools.
Like I mentioned previously, I talk about the voucher program in Iowa as it's the most fiscally irresponsible bill ever to pass the state of Iowa. Do you guys have reporting or auditing systems?
Yeah, I mean, we have absolutely no accountability around this. I would say that, the one thing is that last year when they did this expansion, they kind of threw a bone in and said, well, we're going to require all the private schools that get vouchers to do kind of a nationally standardized test so that we can compare. We still haven't decided what that test is going to be. We had a changeover of our DPI, our superintendent, and our board. So it was put onto that department to do that. And the old superintendent decided to kind of kick the can down the road because she was not going to be reelected. And so she didn't want to deal with it. So we haven't even determined what that test is going to be. But no, we have no reporting requirements, no accountability requirements. And as Democrats, we keep filing, of course, bills to like at least if we're not going to eliminate the program or lower it back to what it was, then let's put some accountability. I mean, most people that find out that we're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars toward these vouchers without any kind of understanding of where it's going or what it's doing. I mean, the public obviously does not like that. And that's why we talk about that as much as we can.
And what do you hear from the Republicans about funding public education?
Oh, they give a lot of good lip service. They say that they've raised teacher pay every year that they've been in power, but we are now 48th in the country, for teacher pay. We are almost, I think, last in the Southeast. I mean, and North Carolina used to be a beacon for public education. It's just really sad how far we've fallen. We had Governor Hunt, who, if you're in the public education sphere, that he was a leader in like pre-K and, all these things. And he was our education governor. And we've really fallen really far. So they talk about that they've raised teacher pay, but it's not keeping up with the cost of living. We have major teacher vacancies. They're not able to keep up with, just the cost of the world right now. And what I'm really worried about is that our teacher pipeline is drying up and that people are not going into the profession. And we're really going to feel that, 5-10 years down the road.
That's a huge concern here in Iowa too. So a little bit about like how I got into politics is, I mean, I was part of the reaction to Trump winning in 2016, and I got more involved. But my grandmother's my biggest inspiration, and she was a fifth grade teacher her whole entire life. So after running for Congress twice, I was asked to run for the state House seat, and I was like, I'm good. I'm exhausted. I'm done. But then the very next day, there were senators down at the Capitol started attacking teachers and called them, they said they had a sinister agenda and all that jazz. And that's when I just like, well, I can't sit on the sideline.
Yeah, I mean, I think every state, is really struggling with these same issues. And it's just sad, like you said, how far states that used to be leaders in this area have fallen. And, that's what made me run for office as well. That, I worked in our public schools for almost 10 years as my kids were growing up and going to school. And I became really active, with our school PTA and then became our county president and then served on our state board and really saw, that those inequities between our rural and urban school districts
Yeah.
is really what drives me because, I don't think any kid should have a disadvantage or an advantage just because of where they live. And, I know this podcast talks a lot about rural issues, and that is a huge rural issue in North Carolina as well.
I mean, to me, public education is the great equalizer. Doesn't matter your zip code, doesn't matter your parents' economic status. It's you have a chance to get a good education or you should have a chance to get a good education and allow you to do whatever you want in life. And that, but it's to me like that's the thing that we're missing in that community base. It makes communities stronger is public education. I feel.
I always say public schools are the heart of our community because it's not just kids going to school there. It's where families gather. It's where kids get services. Even families can get connected to community services. It's a gathering place. It's a place where families and kids feel safe. And, it's really sad, with the immigration issues that are going on now, that now families don't even, kids don't even feel safe at school anymore. And that breaks my heart, for both gun violence, immigration, all these things that are happening in our society. And like I said, school used to be a place where people could gather and feel good. And I that's what I want to work for. And that's why I keep doing this work so that we can restore that sense for
Yeah.
kids.
Uh,
And, the other thing, that I'm sure we could do a whole nother hour on is a case that's been going on here in North Carolina for over 30 years called the Leandro case, which was basically 5 rural school districts that sued the state and said, "You're not providing our kids with a good public education, and we're gonna sue you." And basically our Supreme Court over the last 30 years, many, many appeals, has agreed and said that, yes, we are not doing what we need to do. They provided us a plan. The court got an outside organization to evaluate North Carolina public schools and said, this is what you need to do to be in compliance with your state constitution. And we are still arguing about it because the Republican legislature has said the courts can't make us, basically. So this is another issue of, separation of powers that they're saying, well, the courts can't make us do that. And you're seeing that reflected nationally now, where the Trump administration is like issuing executive orders that, and they're like, well, wait a minute, Congress is supposed to do that.
well, God bless you. Let's talk about the Department of Education at the federal level. And we don't know what's happening with that. They're trying to dismantle that. We don't know what that means. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of what the Department of Education, just like funding wise, and what they do for local schools?
Yeah, I mean, it would be really devastating. I mean, right now, as we're recording this, I believe, all that's happened at this point is that they've cut a lot of the staff from the Department of Education. But if we think about if they start cutting the funding, is when it's really going to affect states. It's already going to affect states because they're dealing with the staff up in the federal office trying to do grant work and, other things. And so that's already going to affect, just kind of the central office daily life of our public schools. But when you think about the funding, I mean, I know in North Carolina, we have almost 80,000 public school employees statewide that are paid for through federal funding. And so if you think about if they cut, all that funding, whether it's for special education, students with disabilities, Title I schools, which are our lower income schools, it is absolutely going to devastate our public school system. And that really, along with everything else in the world, that is very worrisome and keeps me up at night.
That's why we need leaders like yourself to continue to fight for us. How will you reverse the course here when it comes to education?
Well, I mean, what gives me hope is like all the amazing advocates that are continuing to fight. I mean, we had a press conference last week because every year I file a bill around that court case to fund. We're supposed to be in year 6 of this 8-year plan, the implementation of this plan to get in compliance with our Constitution. So every year, this is my 6th year in a row, I filed this bill to fund, this plan. And we had a press conference last week. And one of the original plaintiffs from the case 31 years ago came to my press conference. So that gives me a lot of hope that these people are still fighting and they have not given up. And, we know the political realities in our state. We're up against, a Republican controlled Supreme Court at this point, a Republican majority in our legislature who has been unfriendly to public education. So I'm under no delusion that like they're going to pass my bills or they're going to change the voucher program, at this point. But what gives me hope is like all these people that I work with outside of the building, outside the legislature that just continue to push. They tell their stories about, how their schools are suffering. Teachers come in and tell their stories about taking 2 and 3 jobs to get by. We're not going to stop speaking out. We're not going to stop fighting for our kids because we all know that they're the most important thing. And so, I think that's what gives me hope, and that's what hopefully we'll be able to make a change eventually, and hopefully I'll be around to see it. So.
Absolutely. So wrapping up here, I guess, what is one thing that you could tell listeners if they want to support public education? What do you think they should do?
Vote. Vote for vote for pro-public school candidates. I think that a lot of other issues get a lot of attention, right? We know people are very concerned about the economy and other things that, get a lot of the bulk of the press and the attention. And I wish that the press talked about education and public education more. They have been now that the Department of Education may be, cut. So I've been hearing a lot more, but during the election last year, I didn't feel like it got as much of attention from the press as I hear from voters. When I'm sure you feel the same way when you're at the doors talking to voters as you're campaigning. This is probably one of the number one issues that I hear about because I do represent a suburban area with a lot of families, a lot of families with young kids who are very concerned about their schools, about how their teachers are getting by, that some classrooms don't have teachers, and so my second piece of advice would be continue to tell your story about how great your public school is. Because our narrative right now is that public schools are failing and, they're horrible places. And that is not at all like my experience as a parent of 3 public school kids. As obviously, like I said, I went through my own public school experience. I work in our public schools. I did as a parent volunteer. And this whole narrative that, parents are not welcome in our public schools and they're indoctrinating our kids and teachers, like you said, we're attacking your grandmother, as a 5th grade teacher, it's just ridiculous. So the more that people can tell the story about their amazing public schools and the amazing things that are happening there, we've got to turn the narrative around and make sure that everyone knows how imperative they are for our communities and how important they are, honestly, for the future of our country, because our country was built on public education and we need to make it stay that way.
Absolutely. Julie, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Education is so important, and ensuring it's available to everyone, regardless of who you are or where you live, that's pretty damn important too. So we're glad to have the opportunity to learn more about this issue from educators working to improve policies.
Are you a teacher worried about vouchers, or a parent or student living in rural America who is concerned about cuts and changes to education? Let us know what you think.
Email us. Our email address is podcast@onecountryproject.org. That's podcast@onecountryproject, all one word, .org.
And you can also reach us on Blue Sky and Substack.
Well, thanks for joining us today on The Hot Dish, which is brought to you by the One Country Project, making sure that the voices of the rest of us are heard in Washington. Learn more at onecountryproject.org.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with more Hot Dish, comfort food for Middle America.
Topica.